I'd now like to offer the floor to Mr. Daniel Mitchell. Dan is a senior fellow with the Cato Institute. He specializes in fiscal policy, particularly tax reform, international tax competition, and the economic burden of government spending. He also serves on the editorial board of the Cayman Financial Review. Prior to joining the Cato Institute, Dan was a senior fellow with the Heritage Foundation and an economist for Senator Bob Packwood at the Senate Finance Committee. His work has been published in numerous outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Villanova Law, Public Choice, Emory Law, Forbes USA, Today, Offshore Investment, and Investors Business Daily. He's also published in Playboy. I'm not sure why. Maybe he'll tell us later. He's appeared on all the major TV networks in the United States and has given speeches in almost 40 states and more than 30 countries. He earned a PhD in economics from George Mason University. Dan, it's a pleasure to offer you the floor.
And honored participants, I do have well, there's my PowerPoint presentation. To answer your question, I wrote an article for the German Playboy, but since I don't read German very well, all I can do is look at the pictures, I'm afraid. But what I want to do as an economist is give a slightly different perspective than the lawyers who have participated here. I want to talk about some of the underlying cost-benefit and fiscal policy perspectives on this issue. And I want to start by saying that the real problem is the onshore world. And the real problem is the onshore world because the onshore world, those are the countries that are facing fiscal crisis. Think of the economic chaos and fiscal challenges that you now see in Greece. Those things are going to happen in a lot of other countries in the Western world, mostly because of poorly designed entitlement programs and changing demographics. And those changing demographics are built into the system. And those changing demographics are dooming a lot of these countries to have very serious fiscal problems over the next 5, 10, 15 years. And that is why we see, to a great degree, this assault on low-tax jurisdictions around the world. This just shows the U.S. population pyramid. Historically, countries have always had these pyramids, but you'll see in the U.S., as we're getting toward the current era, it's becoming more of a cylinder, and over time, as you go all the way out to the 2080s, we're becoming an upside-down pyramid. Now, why does this matter? It matters because if you have a reasonably sized welfare state with a population pyramid, it can work. But when you move into a population cylinder or even to an upside-down pyramid, these welfare states collapse. And that's already happening in some European economies, and it's going to happen in the U.S. and other European economies without reform. But of course, what's the problem? Politicians don't want to do reform. They'd much rather think that there's some mythical pot of gold at the end of the offshore rainbow. And so you have the United States and various European welfare states ganging up to impose these initiatives from the OECD, from the European Commission, all designed for one thing: to destroy financial privacy, to undermine fiscal sovereignty, so high-tax nations can prop up their systems for a little bit longer. And the question is, should we allow this damage to the global economy to occur simply because countries like the U.S. and France won't engage in the reforms that are necessary? I have to say, as an economist, this is completely and grossly inconsistent with good public finance. All the public finance literature very clearly shows certain core principles of what a good tax system looks like. And among those principles are low rates, no double taxation, no loopholes, and territoriality. Well, the entire initiatives from the OECD and other international bureaucracies are based on violating two of those principles, because they're based on extraterritorial double taxation of income that is saved and invested. In other words, if nations like the US and France and Germany and Japan didn't have bad tax policy, this entire issue would disappear. And I think that's critically important to think about because, again, as I said, this is an onshore problem, not an offshore problem. Now let's talk about the double standards, and I'll go through this quickly because I think we've already had some very, very deep and illuminating thoughts from Bruce on this issue. But I'll start with something that Bruce didn't mention. all Western nations became rich when government was very, very small and they didn't even have income tax systems. So the idea that the United States is now going to try to penalize and persecute jurisdictions that simply want to follow the same economic development model that made the United States and other Western nations rich, I find that extremely hypocritical. But it's well beyond that. It's not just that we're a tax haven in the United States, as Bruce mentioned. We're unquestionably the world's largest tax haven, and Bruce gave you the details on that. But let me show you something here. This is from the Tax Justice Network, which is never a group I like to cite, since they're very pro-OECD and very much in favor of destroying fiscal sovereignty around the world. But they ranked the United States, as of a couple of years ago, as the 6th biggest tax haven in the world. Just by virtue of policies. Now, Obama, of course, likes to say that the Cayman Islands is a bad jurisdiction, and he attacked the Cayman Islands for having 12,000 companies registered at one building, and he said it was either the biggest building in the world or the biggest tax scam in the world. Well, what he should have done is looked at Delaware, because there's a building in Delaware that's smaller than Ugland House. This building in Delaware doesn't have 12,000 companies registered in it. And by the way, Obama was wrong. There are 18,000 companies registered at Ugland House in the Cayman Islands. But this building in Delaware, which is smaller than Ugland House, has 221,000 companies registered in it. I actually have a company registered in this building. Now, obviously, I've never been to this building, but of course, the reality is that where a company is registered for legal purposes is different from where its headquarters is, where its operations are. And unfortunately, the president should have asked his vice president, Joe Biden, who's from Delaware, and he perhaps could have explained this simple fact of business to the president. Here's a chart showing foreign indirect investment into the U.S. economy. In other words, does the United States benefit from being a tax haven? It sure does. We have trillions of dollars, literally trillions of dollars of indirect investment in U.S. stocks and bonds, in part. I mean, I'm sure there are many, many reasons why money is invested in the U.S. economy, but there's no question that our very attractive tax and privacy laws make the U.S. the biggest tax haven in the world. So we have these massive double standards. It even applies in the issue of money laundering. Again, I don't really need to add to the very learned discourse that Bruce already has shared with us, but I want to share this one quote from the Professor Avinash Prasad, who's an expert on these issues. Money launderers seek to hide their illicit earnings in large financial places like London, New York. There's probably more money laundered in New York in a day than there is in a stereotypical tax haven in an entire year. Because criminals and the FBI in their research has said criminals like to launder their money close to where they obtain it. Well, the overwhelming share of criminal money in the world is drug profits earned in the U.S. You know, the drug dealers aren't creating red flags for themselves by trying to wire money offshore. They're laundering it in U.S. banks. And by the way, another economist point I can't resist making. All the cost-benefit analysis has shown that these anti-money laundering laws and rules and regulations impose far more costs than the benefits that are achieved in terms of theoretically reducing the underlying predicate offenses that money laundering laws were imposed to try to stop in the first place. So no one ever bothers to sort of stop and say, well, wait a second, are we actually getting good bang for the buck? Are we actually achieving something measurable and valuable? And yet all the assessments that have been done by academics who have studied money laundering laws say no, it's not having any effect on underlying predicate offenses, or the effect is so trivial that does it justify the multi-billion-dollar cost that's being imposed on the world economy. And of course, we've already heard from Ryan Pinder, certain jurisdictions are heavily adversely and negatively affected because of all these laws that don't have any underlying justification on a cost-benefit basis. We also have the issue of moving goalposts here. The high tax jurisdictions say one thing one year, and the next year, once they get you to surrender, they say, oh, by the way, we have a new set of demands. The whole OECD project originally started with the idea of information exchange upon request on an individual basis with due process legal protections, and now what has it morphed to? It's morphed to automatic information sharing on a promiscuous basis, even with jurisdictions that have corrupt, venal, or incompetent governments. The original goal, of course, was bilateral tax treaties with both parties gaining some benefits, not just this one-way street where the U.S. says, give us something and we give you nothing in return. Well, now we have FATCA, CRS, the OECD Convention, and all these initiatives are based on you give information to the U.S. gives you nothing back. But again, a small initiative has morphed into something much, much bigger. Same thing with the money laundering laws that I already talked about. Originally, it was a relatively modest thing: know your customer, maintain records, cooperate with law enforcement when there's legitimate reason for government to be snooping into someone's finances. But now we have these very, very ineffective rules that impose very, very heavy costs. And it's not just a de-risking. Millions of people in the United States, and God knows how many tens of millions of people around the world, go unbanked because all the money laundering laws and rules and regulations in effect make them too expensive for the banks to deal with. So poor people are suffering, poor people are being hurt, all for a regime that doesn't actually provide benefits according to the academics who have studied it. So what's the bottom line to all this? Well, unfortunately, I don't have any really good suggestions, because the United States is the 800-pound gorilla in the world economy. And when the United States decides to try to impose bad policy around the world, it's very difficult to resist. But I will say one thing: you have to somehow try to figure out how to resist. Because you know what? If you feed your leg to an alligator, that doesn't turn him into a vegetarian. All that happens is that he'll want another leg or an arm the next day. And again, this is these moving goalposts. All you do is you encourage more demands from the high-tax countries, more demands from the G7-controlled international bureaucracies, and where does this end? It ends with the entire world looking like Greece, I'm afraid, at the end of the day. So with that, I'll turn it back over to the chairman. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share some thoughts.
Dr. Mitchell, thank you very, very much indeed for that extremely, again, insightful presentation, and revealing in many ways, I'm sure, to many of the delegations here and to people who may be watching this on the